The History of Philosophy, Modern Philosophy, Kant to the Present. Lecture 11.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Our subject for this evening and next week is the philosophy of objectivism in relation to the history of Western philosophy. I want to start tonight by delimiting my assignment. I am not going to attempt to give you a running summary of Atlas Shrugged, nor of all the extant objectivist literature. It would obviously not be possible to cover all that material in 2 evenings, nor do I think there would be any purpose served in doing so, because I assume that you are essentially familiar with this material if you chose to register for this course to begin with. So I am instead going to take all this material largely for granted and confine myself instead to 2 more specific interrelated purposes in these 2 lectures. First, I want to pick out and identify for you certain fundamental principles of objectivism, certain principles which are essential to the entire objectivist approach, and indicate to you how they run through the whole philosophy in metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, even in politics. And that, I think, will help you to see how objectivism as an integrated, systematic whole hangs together. It will give you, so to speak, an overview of the objectivist approach to philosophy. And secondly, I want steadily to contrast the principles, the method of approach of objectivism with the principles and approach of previous major philosophies, so that you'll see at least some of the ways in which objectivism's approach is unique or distinctive. Now, primarily in these lectures, I'm going to emphasize the areas of metaphysics and epistemology, because, as you know, these are the areas which determine the essence of a philosophy. This evening is going to be devoted exclusively to metaphysics and epistemology. Next week, we will have some final epistemological points to make, and then I will look at least the foundations of the objectivist ethics and hopefully say a word or 2, at least in conclusion, on politics. All right, let us begin. And the question is, where do we begin? And the first thing to note is that every philosophy starts somewhere, necessarily must, and it builds the rest of its system from its starting points, from its axioms. The first crucial philosophic question is, therefore, where do you start? By the time you begin to philosophize, you are an adult. You already have a whole wealth of concepts. The task of the philosopher, if he's formulating his philosophy, is to determine which of all of these concepts is fundamental and which are derivative, which ones are at the base of human knowledge and which are farther up the structure of knowledge, which are the primaries and which are the derivatives. Now, the first thing to notice about objectivism is that this very approach that I'm indicating is quite distinctive. Objectivism consciously and systematically begins philosophically by naming its primaries and by showing that they are the indispensable primaries, the irreducible concepts on which everything else depends. Now, you might ask, what is distinctive about this? Doesn't every philosopher do this? And the answer to that question is a resounding no. Most philosophers in the history of philosophy do not consciously begin philosophizing by specifying and validating their starting points. The typical case is they just simply plunge in. Usually they plunge in wherever the preceding philosopher left off. They take over his assumptions, his conclusions, which in the typical case means his errors, and they proceed to build falsehood on falsehood until we have a whole structure, a towering of falsehoods built one on top of the other. And you saw that procedure with Kant building on Hume and Hegel building on Kant and the pragmatists building on Hegel and so on. The typical historical philosopher happens to be interested in or concerned with some specific area, some particular topic, problem, or issue, and he starts there, regardless of what earlier concepts are logically presupposed by the place where he starts. And the result is that you get a fundamental inversion at the very outset. Higher order concepts are taken as primaries, and the true primaries, and here I anticipate for a moment I mean existence, consciousness, and identity, these true primaries are ignored and subsequently sabotaged. I want to give you two brief examples of how you can create disaster by starting at the wrong place. Consider, for instance, the pragmatists and the sordid skeptics along that line who pick up where Descartes picked up. Remember, we looked at that. Descartes begins by doubting. He begins with the fact that human beings are fallible. His primary point is human beings are capable of error. Now, where do we go from there? That's his starting point. Well, of course, as you know, the pragmatists go on to say, since human beings are capable of error, we can't be certain of anything. Knowledge of reality is therefore impossible. Therefore, we have to reconceive the whole nature of what knowledge is. We have to abandon the subject-object distinction. We have to abandon the idea of external reality and a consciousness which is the faculty which perceives it. And for the same price, we make the law of identity simply a non-absolute convention of ours. All of that flowing from the beginning point, we start with human beings are capable of error. Now the question is it valid to start a philosophy with the observation that human beings are capable of error? Or does the existence of error, the very concept of error, logically presuppose something more fundamental as its foundation? Well, you simply ask yourself, what does the concept of error rest upon? What does it depend upon? What must we know in order to be able to form such a concept as error? And if you ask that, you'll see very simply that before you could have such a concept as error, there has to be something to know. Namely, there has to be existence. If nothing exists, you can't be right or wrong about it. You can't make mistakes. There has to be someone with the faculty of awareness, someone who is capable of holding views, beliefs, theories, etc. Otherwise, there can't be error. And it must be the case that facts are what they are, regardless of what people believe. Otherwise, of course, no one could ever be wrong. The fact that he believed it would make it so. You cannot begin with the fact of error and then go on to say, how do I know anything exists? Or how do I know I'm conscious? Or how do I know things are what they are? All of these latter points are presupposed by the very concept of error. If you start with the concept of error as your basis for philosophizing, you commit a fundamental inversion. You use a concept while denying the very things that it depends on. And as you know, that is, in objectivist terminology, an arch case of the stolen concept fallacy, using a concept while denying the more fundamental concepts on which it depends. If you start with error as your irreducible primary, you will never discover facts. You will never discover existence, and the results will be the kind of disasters that we have seen growing out of the pragmatist trade. Or take one other example of a false starting point. Take the logical positivist school, which starts, its foundation point is there are two types of propositions. The professor walks in the room and he puts on the board, bachelors are male and bachelors are eccentric, and then proceeds to reel off all his distinctions between analytic and synthetic propositions. And in the course of applying his distinction, he proceeds to say that the statement there is external reality is neither analytic nor synthetic, therefore it's metaphysical and meaningless. Many of them proceed to get rid of consciousness on the ground that that's just a shorthand way of summarizing behavioral data, and of course the law of identity emerges as an empty linguistic tautology. So we start with the concept of propositions. There are propositions as our foundation, and from there we go on to sabotage existence, consciousness, and identity. But again, here is a case where you cannot start a philosophy with the concept of propositions. What does it depend upon to be able to form such a concept as proposition? It's not an irreducible primary. The existence of propositions presupposes the existence of concepts, and the existence of concepts presupposes there is something out there to conceptualize, something which exists. There is someone with the faculty of awareness, someone able to form concepts, and that whatever is out there has identity. It's something, in order for us, therefore, to be able to formulate a concept of it and to formulate propositions about it. Again, a false starting point, a stolen concept, and disaster. You cannot say in someone starting a philosophy, in the beginning there is error, or in the beginning there is propositions, or in the beginning there is language. Now, just from these few examples, which could be multiplied endlessly, you should get an idea that it's of crucial importance where you start philosophically. Well, then, what is the basic primary for objectivism? Where does objectivism start? Well, in a certain sense, we start as philosophers at the same point that we started as babies, namely by looking out at the world. Only now, as philosophers, we know enough to state, as we look out at anything, it is. That is. That is. That is. Things are. Something exists. We start with the fact and the concept of existence. The irreducible primary concept has to be existence. That which is, is. Or putting it in Ayn Rand's formulation, existence exists. This is necessarily the foundation of any subsequent formulations. That there is something, that something exists. Before you can discuss anything else whatever, before you can argue any other question, before you can state what anything is, what kinds of things there are, what problems there are, and so on, before you can discuss how much anybody knows, or what he knows, or how he knows, first you must know there is something which you're aware of. There is something which you perceive. If nothing exists, everything else is wiped out. The first irreducible axiom is existence. If you were rewriting Genesis from an objectivist point of view, you'd say in the beginning was existence. All right, you've now grasped that something exists. You're now aware of that fact, which immediately implies a second axiom. That you exist possessing consciousness. Consciousness being the faculty of perceiving existence. The faculty of being aware of that which is. And inherent in saying there is something which you're aware of is there is something which you're aware of. And again, the fact of consciousness is a fundamental starting point. Before you can discuss any other question of knowledge, you have to grant that you are conscious. You can't talk about the distinction between perceptual versus conceptual awareness until you have established there is awareness. You can't talk about is your awareness certain or uncertain or how many degrees of probability it has until you first establish that you have the faculty of awareness. You can't talk about how do people discover or recognize or grasp or any such term before you establish that you have the faculty of consciousness. If there's no such thing as consciousness, if it's non-existent, the whole question of knowledge and thus of philosophy cannot arise. Now I'd like you to note the characterization of consciousness because it's going to be central as we proceed. Ayn Rand characterizes consciousness as the faculty of perceiving that which exists. The faculty of perceiving existence. And here we use perceiving in the widest sense of the term, meaning simply the faculty which enables you to be aware of that which exists. To be conscious is to be conscious of something. And there's nothing to be conscious of but that which is existence. A consciousness with nothing to be conscious of is a contradiction in terms. A consciousness conscious only of itself is a contradiction in terms. Before it could grasp that it was conscious, it had to be conscious of something. Consciousness is the faculty of perceiving that which exists. So we have two irreducible axioms, existence and consciousness. But our survey of primaries is not yet complete, because we have to introduce one further fundamental axiom at this point. We have to be clear at the very outset, what does it mean for a thing to exist? What does it mean to be? What is the most fundamental fact we can state about the nature of existence? To which the answer is to be something, to have some nature, to possess identity. The opposite of existence is nothing, non-existence. The essence of being is being something. Everything which exists is something specific. If it wasn't something in particular, it would be nothing in particular. If it would be nothing in particular, that means it's nothing. If it's nothing, that means it's non-existent. Everything is what it is. A is A. And that, of course, is the law of identity. And by the identity of an existent, we mean simply that which it is, the sum of its characteristics. Now, as you know, Ayn Rand formulates the law of identity in a particular way, which I call your attention to. She states, existence is identity. And I'd like to call your attention to that formulation. She does not say existence has identity. She does not say there is existence, and it happens to have as a distinct attribute the characteristic of identity. The relation of identity to existence is not like the relation of a coat of paint to a house, where you can have a house and it happens to be red, but you could have the same house and it happened to be green. If you formulated it in that fashion, existence has identity, you would suggest to someone listening, well, the question, how do you know existence will continue to have this particular attribute? You would suggest that identity is in some way separable from the fact of existence. But the fact that Ayn Rand's formulation calls attention to is that to be literally is to be something. That's what it literally is to exist. In other words, the concepts of existence and identity are indivisible. They can never be sundered or separated, neither in fact, in reality, nor in human awareness. Now consider this for a moment. Consider it first in fact, in reality. If you say something exists, then you have said something exists. If it's not something, it's nothing. It's non-existent. Or if you focus on the something and you say there is a something, then there is something. If it's not the case that it is, then it isn't, i.e., it's non-existent, it's nothing. You can't separate existence and identity. And the same is true in terms of human awareness. If you're aware of a something, then it's a something that is, because if it isn't, it's nothing, and you can't be aware of it. And if you're aware of an existent, then you are aware that something exists, because if you're not aware of something, then it is of nothing. In other words, you're not aware of an existent. The fact of existence and the fact of identity are inseparable in reality and in human awareness. And thus the formulation, existence is identity. So we have the three fundamental axioms of the objectivist philosophy: existence, consciousness, identity. Now, before we go on, let us note the status of these three. Have I proved them to you? Have I proved to you that something exists, that there's consciousness, that A is A? And the answer, of course, is clearly no. Proof is the process of deriving an idea from antecedently known propositions. Proof is the process of establishing something on the basis of earlier knowledge. Proof, you derive a conclusion from antecedently known premises. But now we are at the very base of all knowledge. There is nothing that can be known prior to knowing existence, consciousness, identity. They are the foundation of all proof and all arguments. They cannot themselves be derived from anything antecedent. Well, what then is their status? How do we know that they are true? And the answer to that is you know them simply by perceiving reality. In any act of perceiving reality, these are facts which are directly evident and inescapable. They are, to use a term in a technical sense, literally self-evident, which means they require no antecedent knowledge in order to be learned. In fact, of course, they have to be known to know anything else. Simply to look at reality is to know, implicitly if not explicitly, that they are true. Implicit, we can put it this way: in any knowledge, in any awareness of reality, is this proposition: there is something I am aware of. There is, that's existence. Something, that's identity. I'm aware of, that's consciousness. Now, all that philosophy does is give a general abstract statement to the facts which are self-evident in each perception. If you perceive an apple, then it's self-evident that it exists, it's something, and you perceive it. And the same is true for oranges, bananas, peaches, subways, and so on. Now, philosophy merely states these elementary facts in universal form. It says whatever exists, exists. Whatever a thing is, it is what it is, and in whatever form you are aware, you are aware. You have the faculty of consciousness. So that philosophic axioms are merely abstract statements of self-evident facts, available to and confirmable by direct perception. Now you know that from many quarters today there will be a chorus of outcries at the use of such a concept as the self-evident. There are a few concepts which have come under such attack. People will tell you, well, it's self-evident to you, but it isn't self-evident to me. But I want to point out to you that the three axioms that I mentioned have a built-in protection against all such attacks. Because being philosophic axioms, they are at the foundation of all other concepts, of all thought and knowledge, so that they have to be used and assumed by everyone, including their opponents, including the very people who denounce the self-evident or denounce these axioms. Now I want to illustrate this on one example. I'll just take one specific charge raised by opponents of the self-evident and show you how they have to rely on these axioms even to enunciate their charge. And if you get the pattern of this example, it'll be applicable to any and all such objections. Now, the typical modernist on the street will hear you say that there are three self-evident axioms, and he will come up to you and say, how can you be sure, after all, people disagree about their axioms? Some of them say it's not self-evident to me, I don't agree. So how can you be sure? Now, take this just in pattern. I realize it's not a very high-class objection, but just in pattern. The person is entirely content to use the concept of disagreement. That's okay. There is such a phenomenon as disagreement that he's prepared to stake his life on. But in question is existence, consciousness, and identity. Now, the best procedure if you were dealing with such a person, simply tell him, well, no, there's no such thing as disagreement at all. Everybody agrees on everything. And he will look at you in the typical case baffled and say, what do you mean? People disagree about all sorts of things. And then you simply say to them, well, but how could they? There's nothing to disagree about. There's no subject matter. Nothing exists. So how could there be disagreement? To which he will come back and say, that's ridiculous. All sorts of things exist. And you say, well, even so, there can't be any disagreement because people can't hold any views. They can't hold any theories. They're all unconscious, so how could there be disagreement? To which he comes back and says, oh, that's fantastic. Obviously, people are conscious. They hold all sorts of ideas and thoughts. Then you say, well, even so, what's wrong with disagreement? Maybe both sides in a disagreement are right. And the person comes back and says, look, if two people contradict each other, they can't both be right. After all, things are what they are. Is it? In other words, you see, the concept of disagreement presupposes existence, consciousness, and identity just as every other concept does. As soon as a person opens his mouth to make a challenge against these axioms, he must employ a concept which presupposes them and has thereby conceded the entire case. Now, we could multiply this type of example endlessly, but I think one point is enough. The general point, I think, is clear. Every accusation against these axioms, every utterance of every human being rests on and presupposes the axioms of existence, consciousness, and identity. They are invulnerable because they are the basis of everything else. So we have now identified three inescapable philosophic primaries. Now let's formulate explicitly in developing objectivism one last metaphysical proposition. This is not a new tenet. It's implicit in what we've said so far, but it's desirable here to make it explicit. It pertains to the relation of existence and consciousness. Now I'll go back for a moment to the way I briefly sketched in the development of these axioms. I started with existence. That was first. I said existence exists, and only then did I introduce consciousness as the faculty of perceiving existence. Now, why couldn't I do it in reverse? Why couldn't I start a philosophy by saying I am conscious, or consciousness is conscious, and then proceed from there? Because the obvious question would be, if I uttered I am conscious, what are you conscious of? Until you state existence, there's nothing to be conscious of, since consciousness is only the faculty of perceiving that which exists. First, there must be existence, then, and only then, can there be consciousness of existence. Now, this basic fact we summarize, as you know, in the statement, existence has metaphysical primacy. We refer to this tenet as the primacy of existence, which means simply existence exists. It is what it is, independent of consciousness. It comes first. It sets the terms. Consciousness is a dependent, speaking now metaphysically. It is passive. Now, this doesn't mean that it doesn't have to go through a whole series of processes in order to acquire knowledge. But speaking metaphysically, consciousness can do nothing to reality. Its sole nature is to look out and grasp, to perceive, to recognize, to identify what's out there. Using the pragmatist term for it, consciousness is nothing metaphysically but a spectator. It doesn't create reality. It doesn't dictate to it. It doesn't control existence. All it can do is perceive what's out there. That viewpoint is the primacy of existence. And you know, of course, what the alternative to that viewpoint is. The primacy of consciousness. And that would be the view that consciousness is the primary factor, that it is the independent one which sets the terms, that it has primacy, that it rules or controls existence, and that existence is simply a byproduct or derivative or creation of consciousness. Now, the basic fallacy in all forms of the primacy of consciousness is very simple to state. The primacy of consciousness is incompatible with the law of identity. And since identity is inherent in existence, that means the primacy of consciousness is incompatible with the very fact of existence. The law of identity states A is A. The advocate of the primacy of consciousness states, oh no, it doesn't have to be A if consciousness doesn't want it to be. The law of identity states things are what they are. The primacy of consciousness advocate says things can be whatever the ruling consciousness chooses them to be, if only it believes hard enough or wishes hard enough or whichever. You can look at it this way. The primacy of consciousness metaphysics is an attempt to have existence and eat it too. To have it because without existence there can't be any consciousness. But to eat it because it wants existence to be malleable to the whims of some consciousness. It wants existence to exist as nothing in particular, with no particular nature, no particular identity. But existence is identity, and consequently consciousness can have no power to alter the metaphysical identity of things. It can only be the faculty of perceiving. Now, if I were asked what is most essential to and distinctive to objectivism's metaphysics, I would say, unquestionably, it's the tenet of the primacy of existence. The history of philosophy, with the rare exceptions, has been the story of the march of the primacy of consciousness. Existence in the history of philosophy has been attacked and dissolved in every possible way, and even some impossible. In principle, there are three different versions of the primacy of consciousness in the history of philosophy, which I want to look at for a moment to set the objectivist approach in clear relief for you. And these three different versions derive from three different answers to the question upon whose consciousness or upon which consciousness is existence dependent. They all agree that existence is dependent upon consciousness, but they merely differ in the particular consciousness that they pick out as the ruling or dominating one. Now let's take a quick review here of this spectacle of the primacy of consciousness in its three forms. Now, the earliest version of the primacy of consciousness was the supernaturalistic version, which dominated philosophy approximately from the time of Plato until about the time of Kant. Now, in that view, existence, as you know, is dependent upon or a product of a supernatural, a cosmic consciousness, typically called God. This view is implicit in Plato, in his theory of the world, true reality as a realm of universals which gives birth to this physical world. I may say that for Plato himself, universals do not exist in consciousness, they just float free in their own dimension, but his followers quickly grasped that universals, being abstractions, couldn't exist by themselves, that they obviously depended upon a mind to exist, and that therefore, if there was to be a world of universals, they had to exist in some mind, and that was one of the jobs of the Judeo-Christian God. He became the home of Plato's universals, which were converted into thoughts in the mind of God. And thus, deriving from Plato, we had the whole religious Judeo-Christian version of the primacy of consciousness. Now, what is God? He is the consciousness that creates existence, keeps it in existence, that makes it lawful, and periodically subjects it to his desires. And when he does that, we call that, or people who believe that, call that a miracle. That's the supernaturalistic version, which has still got many advocates today. You can see it, for instance, a typical person, which there are some still today, who will say, for instance, in discussing the question of life, can you create life? Suppose you say, no, I can't. He'll say, well, you see, it must be God then that created it. The idea that it could exist as a natural phenomenon, a development inherent in existence, is completely unbelievable to such a person. The automatic assumption is a phenomenon of existence must derive from a consciousness, and if it's not from yours, it must be then from a supernatural. Well, as we know, in the 18th century, Kant appeared, and he proceeded to secularize this supernaturalistic view. And so we get the social version of the primacy of consciousness. Human consciousness now, in Kant's version, collective social consciousness of mankind, that's what creates and orders existence, namely the phenomenal world. God's will becomes man's categories. The way human consciousness works, the conceptual integrating methods it uses, creates, shapes, orders the world. And this social version of the primacy of consciousness, as we've seen, was taken over by the Deweyan school of pragmatists with their view that the purposes, the goals of society, for instance, are the standard of truth, that a fact is what we don't have to doubt because it continues to work, and to work for them means satisfy social purposes. It was taken over by the positivists in the view that logic and its laws, for instance, are determined by social conventions. It's taken over by the analysts in their view that the standard in philosophy is how people speak, how they use symbols. All of these are variants of the social version of the primacy of consciousness. And a third version has appeared sporadically in history and is progressively having its innings today. It's really the last possibility, and we can refer to it as the personal primacy of consciousness. This is your last choice if you're going to be an advocate of the primacy of consciousness. If it's not his consciousness with a capital H, if it's not the supernatural consciousness, and it's not ours collectively, it's not a social consciousness which controls existence, then the last choice is mine, each individual, personal, individual consciousness controlling existence. Now, this view had its advocates in the ancient world, certain skeptics in the ancient world. In the modern, contemporary world, you can see it in the more overtly subjectivist philosophers. For instance, we saw in the James Schiller version of pragmatism, according to which truth is what serves your personal purposes. And of course, this particular version is all over existentialism, with its combination of avowed subjectivism and alleged individualism, which amounts to, for the existentialists, the idea that the feelings of each individual are the standard of truth and reality. And this personal version has its followers on the street all over today, and people who say, well, I believe so-and-so, therefore it's true for me. And you don't believe it, therefore it's not true for you. Each of us creates his own world as a result of our own subjective beliefs. Now, if you look at this spectacle, get this broad perspective on the history of philosophy, you will see that existence has repeatedly been made subservient to and dependent on consciousness. It's been made a function of the will of a supernatural consciousness, of a category of the noumenal consciousness, of the purposes or linguistic practices of collective human consciousness, of the whims of an individual consciousness, you name it. Now, have there been philosophers on the primacy of existence axis historically? Well, yes, there have been a few, but even they have not been fully explicit or consistent on this issue. Take, for instance, Parmenides in ancient Greece, who in a way is the first author of the primacy of existence. You know, or you may know his famous principle, what is, and what is not, which was an early version, of course, of existence exists. But Parmenides did not know how to carry that out. He went off the rails on the problem of change. He agreed with Heraclitus that change implied a contradiction. He concluded that we didn't therefore perceive the world as it really is. He just took the other side of Heraclitus' problem, Heraclitus' conclusion, and said there really is no change since contradictions are impossible. And thus he introduced a fundamental breach between consciousness and existence and opened the door to all sorts of subsequent trouble. He was, of course, one of the roads that led to Plato. Even if we look at Aristotle, who is far and away the best philosopher on this question, the primacy of existence, he is not fully consistent. Now let me give you just an example or two. You may know about Aristotle's God, which he calls the prime mover. How he gets to it is here irrelevant, but in any event, he believes in a God of sorts. He's certainly not a typical Judeo-Christian God, but he's a God. And if you ask Aristotle, what is God? He characterizes God as a mind engaged in thinking, but, says Aristotle, he is this God, this prime mover, is utterly unaware of, utterly unconscious of the world, utterly unconscious of existence. What is he conscious of? According to Aristotle, only himself. Aristotle describes God, as he construes it, as thought thinking about thinking, or alternatively as pure self-consciousness. A consciousness conscious of nothing but itself. Now you see, on a primacy of existence, on a primacy of existence metaphysics, such an idea is an impossibility. Because it would be the idea of consciousness as a self-sufficient entity, a consciousness which needs no existence, a consciousness which is something other than the faculty of perceiving existence. Now I could give you other examples from Aristotle in his explanation, for instance, of motion. He ultimately explains motion by saying that the various heavenly spheres have intelligences connected to them, which are certain types of consciousness, and they very strongly admire God, they fall in love with him, they are attracted to him, they desire to emulate him, and the result is they start moving in circles in order to emulate God's perfection, and thus motion is introduced into the world. Now here is another simple case in which Aristotle is, by implication, endorsing the primacy of consciousness. There's a fact about existence, namely motion, which he refuses to allow to be simply an irreducible fact of existence, and considers it satisfying as an explanation only when he is able to tie it back to the activities of some consciousness. In this case, these supernatural intelligences and their love affair with the prime mover. Now, I could give you other examples, and you probably will know them if you know Aristotle. In this respect, there has never been a philosophy to the present which explicitly states the issue of the primacy of existence and carries it out all the way to metaphysics, epistemology, to ethics, to every issue of philosophy. And that is specifically in metaphysics what objectivism does. In this respect, I would characterize objectivism as the primacy of existence come for the first time to full, consistent, systematic, self-conscious expression. Now, in order to illustrate this for you, I want to look briefly at a few issues from various fields of philosophy and show you in what way the objectivist position depends on and expresses the primacy of existence. Now, we contrast that repeatedly to the typical alternative positions on these issues that would be taken in the history of philosophy by various advocates of the primacy of consciousness. So our theme for a little while now is going to be the ways in which the primacy of existence is characteristic and distinctive of the objectivist approach to a whole variety of issues. Well, let's first just take an example from epistemology. Now, I may observe at the outset here that according to objectivism, the very existence of such a subject as epistemology depends upon the primacy of existence. If the primacy of consciousness were true, there would be no need of any such subject as epistemology, according to objectivism. Why? Well, what is epistemology? It's a science which studies the nature and methods of human knowledge. It tells us the processes that we have to go through in order to acquire knowledge, the rules and criteria which determine when our knowledge is valid. Well, what then is the presupposition of the entire subject? That we can acquire knowledge only by engaging in certain specific processes. Well, why? Why do we have to engage in certain specific processes? Why can't we do anything we feel like and count whatever comes up as knowledge? Why do we have to use specific methods of validation before something counts as knowledge? And the only answer to that is because the fact that an idea passes through your head doesn't ensure that it's true. You can misuse your cognitive faculty, you can err, and therefore you need criteria, you need standards, you need principles to tell you how you must function if you are to achieve knowledge. In other words, the sheer fact that you believe something is irrelevant to truth, irrelevant to knowledge. Now, why is that so? Because consciousness does not have primacy, because existence exists. And if you want to know it, you then have to adapt yourself to, conform yourself to existence. You have to be guided at each step by the facts of existence. If consciousness had primacy, then no epistemology would be necessary or possible. Now you can see this simply enough. If you imagine for a moment, just as a sort of pedagogical experiment, that there was a God and you could talk to him. And suppose you tried to introduce him to epistemology, and give him epistemological advice. And you go up to him and you say in some divine form of communication, "But God, you've been engaging in some pretty sloppy thinking recently. You've been making all sorts of errors, and here are the principles you should follow." Now God, if he were there, would very properly answer, "Don't tell it to me. I am incapable of sloppy thinking or error. If I think it, that's how it's got to be, because I create existence by my thinking. There can be no such thing as standards to which my thinking has to conform, because my thinking is the standard to which existence has to conform." You see. And of course, if he existed, he'd have a point. In other words, epistemology presupposes that existence has primacy, that there are consciousnesses which can depart from reality and therefore be wrong, and the subject then proceeds to specify for those consciousnesses how to stay on the track, how to ensure that their conclusions correspond to the facts of existence. Now, unfortunately, this is emphatically not how most philosophers in history have regarded epistemology. They have interpreted epistemology as so much else in accordance with the primacy of consciousness. Now let's take a look at that. Suppose you ask most traditional philosophers a broad epistemological question. Suppose you ask them this question, in the most general terms: what is the right method to follow to acquire knowledge? What should I consult? What should I look at? What should I study if knowledge is my goal and I wish to ground and validate my knowledge? What should be my epistemological guide? Now, since most traditional philosophers are advocates of the primacy of consciousness, they will answer you at one point or another: you don't have to confine yourself to the study of existence. You don't have to confine yourself to the study of facts. At certain crucial points, you can bypass existence, you can bypass facts, and direct your attention, get your guidance by consulting the consciousness and control of reality. After all, they say, consciousness X, whichever variety they subscribe to, consciousness X is in charge of reality. It has primacy. It sets the terms. And therefore it's perfectly safe. It's perfectly reliable to go directly to the source, so to speak, to consult the consciousness in charge of reality in order to validate your knowledge. So to speak, to go over the head of existence to its master. And you can know that reality will obey, that it'll take care of itself, because after all, it's determined and controlled by that ruling consciousness. Now, this pattern of consulting consciousness on the implicit premise of the primacy of consciousness is enormously common in the history of epistemology. Take a supernaturalist of a religious sort. He gets, let us say, revelations, which supersede reason and fact. And you ask him, how does he know the revelations are valid? And he says they come from God. And you ask him, did God give him proof along with his revelations? Did God deliver himself of syllogistic argumentation along with the revelations? And of course he says, that's ridiculous. God doesn't have to function in that way. If God believes it, that makes it so. God doesn't have to give proof. God creates existence, and therefore what he says is guaranteed to be true. Existence cannot disobey him. What if there is an apparent clash between God's deliverances and the facts that seem to be obvious? Well, such an individual will tell you God will reconcile it all in the future. And if you ask him how does he know that, he says he has faith. And if you ask him what's the real basis for your faith, he says, look, God is in charge here. No fact can invalidate what he declares. We don't have to worry about facts. God will take care of it. Now there is a simple model of the primacy of consciousness metaphysics underlying a certain epistemological approach. Or we can look at the traditional rationalists for a variant of this viewpoint. Knowledge for the traditional rationalists is grounded, as we know, in innate ideas. You build up your philosophy by starting with certain innate starting points and then deducing them step by step. You don't have to consult existence. You don't have to look at facts to arrive at knowledge, at least not at the crucial foundation of your knowledge. And now if we ask, why are the innate ideas reliable? Well, most of them said because they're given us by God. And Descartes added, God being perfect, he wouldn't deceive us. So knowledge, you see, is in pattern a process of communication between consciousnesses. It comes from the supreme ruling consciousness to the finite human ones. And existence is simply out of the picture to this extent. We ground our knowledge on this view without reference to it. And again, we can trust the deliverer of the innate ideas because he controls existence. Or take an example from the social version in epistemology, from Kant. How do we ground and validate our knowledge for Kant? Again, we look to consciousness. In his case, we look inward. We study the structure and categories of our consciousness. We can rely on whatever is guaranteed by our consciousness because the world is its product. So if we find causality or logic or the rules of geometry or whatever embedded in the structure of our mind, then we can rely on it. Knowledge is a process of looking to the consciousness that controls the world. For the pragmatists, this is even more obvious because there aren't any facts, they say, in the old-fashioned sense of fact. Well, what do we look to then to ground our knowledge? Well, ultimately, the purposes, the convenience, the goals of society. That's what determines the conceptual apparatus we are to adopt, and that in turn controls and shapes existence. We appeal to a fact about the consciousness of society, of people in general. And the same in various forms is obviously true of the positivists and the analysts. For all these different movements, regardless of what particular consciousness they appeal to, we get our basic principles, or at least certain crucial ones, by bypassing reality, bypassing existence, and looking instead to God and his messages, or to society and its conventions, to human consciousness and its structure or content or purposes, etc. Now contrast this whole primacy of consciousness approach to epistemology with the approach of objectivism. If you are on the premise of the primacy of existence, then you will say knowledge can be gained in only one fundamental way, namely by the study of existence. There can be no appeal to any consciousness for the validating of knowledge. No appeal to God and revelations. No burrowing into human consciousness to study its content or structure as the basis of knowledge. No Ford Foundation sponsored survey of social purposes or linguistic habits or human convenience or subjective whim, etc. On a primacy of existence metaphysics, epistemology tells you knowledge is acquired by observing the facts of existence, and every single step in its acquisition must be dictated by facts of existence. We begin with sense experience, which gives us facts of existence. We'll say more about that later this evening. We form our concepts on the basis of facts, on the basis of observed similarities and differences, not on the basis, I note, of subjective convenience. Again, we'll say more about that later in these two lectures. We make our inferences on the basis of the facts, of the law of identity, and that's a fact of existence. In other words, we do not burrow into consciousness. We look at existence. And that, for objectivism, is what it actually means to go by reason. Ayn Rand's definition of reason is the faculty which identifies and integrates the material provided by man's senses. But if you look at it from the aspect that we're here concerned with, reason is simply the method of knowing existence which is based on and derived from the facts of existence. Reason is the method of acquiring knowledge in which every step is dictated by existence, the starting point and every step in the method by which conclusions are drawn from those starting points. Many schools have claimed to be advocates of reason, but for all these primacy of consciousness variants, whether they call it reason or not, it really is various versions of mysticism. As we know, it ultimately is various versions of appeal to feeling. And if you ask yourself, well, why is mysticism wrong? Why aren't feelings tools of cognition? Why don't they lead us to truth? The only answer can be because facts are what they are, regardless of who feels what. In other words, because of the primacy of existence. Now that's just to indicate to you in what way the basic objectivist approach to epistemology is dictated by the primacy of existence. Now we're going to return to epistemology shortly, but I want first to touch on a few other issues in philosophy, simply so you see the scope of this issue of the primacy of existence, because it's all over the place. Now I'll discuss a few issues, but in each case I want to give you just an indication of the way in which the primacy of existence versus the primacy of consciousness enters in the interpretation of that question. And I don't think you'll have difficulty developing it, any one of these points by yourself. Consider now another issue from the field of metaphysics, a perennial issue running through all of philosophy, the mind-body question. And I'm thinking particularly the mind-body dichotomy, the theory that there is a clash between the mind and the body, the clash between the spiritual and the material. You know that theory and its progeny of dichotomies, theory versus practice, the moral versus the practical, pure science versus applied science, etc. The clearest expression or advocate of this type of view is the Platonic Christian tradition, according to which, as you know, the soul is a non-material entity which belongs to another dimension. The body is, of course, a low physical phenomenon. It's the prison of the soul, and the proper way of life should be to fight down your mortal enemy, the body, to live ascetically, and one day escape into the other dimension when you die. Now I want to consider this issue for a moment. The idea of a clash between mind and body. Now think of it from this point of view. Mind is obviously consciousness, a form of consciousness. Body is existence, or obviously a portion of existence. The idea of a clash between mind and matter, between the spiritual and the physical, is really, in its ultimate form, the idea of a clash between consciousness and existence. Now, the idea that there would be a clash between these two is impossible on a primacy of existence metaphysics. If you hold a primacy of existence metaphysics, the idea of a clash between Consciousness in existence is literally inconceivable, because consciousness is simply the faculty of perceiving existence. It's wholly subservient to existence. Its goal and nature is nothing but to discover what's there. Consciousness couldn't be an adversary of existence on the primacy of existence view. It couldn't be an adversary because it has no weapons with which to wage a war. It has nothing to fight with. You may as well speak of a clash between your faculty of vision and this table. Now, obviously, you can look at this table or not, but if somebody told you there is a perennial war running through the world between my eyesight and this table, you'd say, that's fantastic, that is bizarre, that's unbelievable. How could anybody talk of a war between a faculty of awareness and the object of that faculty? Where does the idea of a war come from then, of this whole mind-body clash? Well, ultimately it derives from the primacy of consciousness metaphysics. And the steps are like this. First, you advocate the primacy of consciousness. You hold that existence should be malleable to what consciousness declares. And then you find that existence does not obey you. That it goes its own way, and the consciousness that is supposed to have control over it can't enforce its edicts. And then you moan, you see, there's an inherent war between the two, an inherent opposition, an inherent clash. Consciousness has spoken, and existence is no good, matter is no good, because it's recalcitrant, it didn't obey. Now, I'm not just hypothesizing this. To give you one actual example, which is what first drew my attention to this point, the best example of this very process is given in Plato. In one of his dialogues, he is discussing the formation of the physical world, and he tells us that at an early stage, matter was very chaotic and disorganized, and at a certain point, a spirit or soul, a god of sorts, entered the scene, looked to the world of universals, saw this vision of perfect forms, and then proceeded to try to organize or shape matter in the image of the perfect forms. And Plato recounts this story and tells us that tragically this God, this soul, this consciousness was unable to succeed fully in organizing matter. Matter, says Plato, was resistant. It was recalcitrant. It would take the imprint of this soul only to a certain extent, and at a certain point, a kind of brute resistance set in. And according to Plato, therefore, in this particular dialogue, matter is the source of evil, the source of imperfection. Consciousness tried its best to have a decent world, but matter resisted. When would matter be perfect on this view? Well, if it was subservient completely to consciousness. But it isn't, and therefore for Plato there's an inherent conflict in the universe. And matter is the source of evil. Here you see the idea. The fact that existence exists is in conflict with the desire of a consciousness to be omnipotent, and consequently the conclusion is drawn there's a clash between the two. Now we could make this same point on all of the various variants of the mind-body question. Consider just the theory-practice dichotomy. Now you know the number of people who say there's an inherent clash between theory and practice. It's good in theory, but it doesn't work in practice. Now on a primacy of existence metaphysics, there's no possibility, there's no such thing as something which is good in theory, but doesn't work in practice. That's an impossibility, metaphysical impossibility. Why? Well, because a theory is a study of facts. A good theory is one which takes into account and integrates all the relevant facts. Well, as such, it has to work when you act on it. The world you're thinking about is existence. And that's the same world that you're acting in.
If your thought is in accordance with existence, your action will then necessarily have to be successful. But now, if you're an advocate of the primacy of consciousness, you will end up with a very different view of the relation between theory and practice. Because if you're an advocate of the primacy of consciousness, what for you is the object of theory? What is it that you study or attend to or focus on when you theorize? Well, as we've seen, at some crucial point, you turn your attention away from existence to the realm of consciousness, to some data or product or content or state of consciousness. Whether it's the world of forms of Plato, or innate ideas, or linguistic practices, or whatever it happens to be. And what is the implicit premise of such a person? Well, existence will take care of itself. It will obey, it will fall into line. And then, of course, he finds that it doesn't. He has got his theory by studying one realm and expected existence to obey, and it doesn't. And then he moans, it's good in theory, but it didn't work in practice. The real source of that, you see, is the idea there are two realms. The realm that you theorize about, namely consciousness, and the realm you act in, namely existence. And existence is then condemned as inferior because it doesn't live up to the arbitrary demands of consciousness. You could summarize this point by saying this. The whole mind-body dichotomy, including the theory-practice version of it, is a product of a primacy of consciousness advocate who got burned and is now disillusioned. Now I want to look at still another issue from the point of view of the primacy of existence. Again, to show you the enormous ramifications of this theme, which runs all the way through the objectivist philosophy. Consider the question of free will now, from this point of view. Now, if you look at the history of philosophy, what is traditionally regarded as the enemy of free will? Well, you know that as philosophers have set it up throughout history, they see it as either you believe in free will or you believe in the law of cause and effect. And the traditional dichotomy that philosophers have argued with is if you believe in free will, if you believe man has choice, then you must say the law of cause and effect doesn't hold. It's not an absolute. If you believe that the law of cause and effect holds and is an absolute, then you have to be a determinist and say there is no free choice. Now consider this particular one from the point of view of the primacy of existence and the primacy of consciousness. What is cause and effect? Obviously, that's a law of existence. What is free will? Well, that is a condition, a capacity of a certain type of consciousness. So, traditionally, the issue of free will has been fought out. If it's fought as free will versus cause and effect, that means again it's a variant of the so-called battle between consciousness and existence. And the major advocates of free will have said that if facts are facts, if A is A, if there are absolute laws, in other words, if existence has primacy, then we have to abandon free will. And so they have proceeded to construe free will in terms of the primacy of consciousness. Free will has been construed as the ability of a consciousness to break the laws of existence, specifically to break the law of cause and effect, to act causelessly. In other words, to violate the law of identity, to defy reality, to violate the primacy of existence. And it's by this means that you get such concepts as we saw last week of free will. Dostoevsky, remember the idea that 2 and 2 equals 4 is the enemy of free will. Free will is the ability, on that view, to defy the laws of nature and mathematics. Or such a view as we saw Sartre holding, that free will presupposes that man has no nature, no identity. On the primacy of consciousness view, Freedom, free will, is the ability to make existence dependent on your whims. It's the ability to subjugate existence, you see. Now you contrast this with the objectivist view. Primacy of existence is the foundation. Free will cannot, therefore, consist of breaking or defying any laws of existence. Consciousness is the faculty of perceiving, of being aware of existence, and that's all. It is not a diabolical power out to wreak havoc with reality. Well, what then can its freedom consist of on this view? Well, it only has one possible area of freedom on such a metaphysics. Either to perform its metaphysical function or not. Either to focus on existence or to refuse to, and then suffer the consequences. In other words, either to think or not to think. You see, the metaphysics of the primacy of existence delimits in advance what is possible to a consciousness when you come to specify its area of freedom. If you hold the primacy of existence, that determines in advance that when you get to the question of free will, you cannot construe freedom as the ability to break laws, to violate causality, to will uncaused phenomena, etc. In advance, from the sheer fact of the primacy of existence, you know there can be only one possible area of freedom: to focus and perceive existence or not to. Now, of course, I haven't given you proof of free will in my discussion here. I'll be glad to do that in the question period if you're interested. I'm merely here concerned to illustrate how it is that if you accept the primacy of existence metaphysics, that has set in advance limits on what the nature of free will can consist of. Consciousness is the faculty of perceiving. Then, if it has freedom, it can only be to perceive or not. Now, next week we were going to discuss some further implications of the primacy of existence, specifically in the objectivist ethics. But for now, let us take a break, and then when we come back, focus a little more specifically on some of the roles of the law of identity in objectivism. Now, I want to turn to the law of identity and another, of course, fundamental principle of objectivism, and show you how it runs through many aspects of the objectivist philosophy. A is everywhere in objectivism. In metaphysics, of course, it's at the root of the primacy of existence, as we've seen. It's because A that the primacy of existence is true. Also in metaphysics, the law of identity is the basis of the law of cause and effect, a point which we have discussed many lectures earlier in our discussion of what was wrong with humankind. You recall the point that entities have identity and can only act, therefore, in accordance with their identity, and therefore in any particular set of circumstance, an entity can act in only one fashion, a manner which is consonant with and expressive of its identity, and therefore same cause, same effect. We live in an orderly causal universe. I may say parenthetically, again, notice the contrast between the objectivist approach to the question of cause and effect and that of many other schools. The typical view, again in the history of philosophy, is that if you leave existence to its own devices, it would go wild at any second. That's the typical Humean view. And that therefore, if you're to have an orderly, lawful world, what is required? Well, some consciousness which injects or introduces the order. In the supernaturalistic version, that's supposed to be one of God's main functions, to keep existence orderly. And that argument, as you know, appears approximately every 6 months in the Reader's Digest as a new argument for the existence of God. In the Kantian view, causality is maintained by a category of human consciousness. In the pragmatist view, it is causality is sustained by the fact that it is convenient to society to believe it. In all cases, if there is an appeal to something about consciousness in order to account for order, for law, for causality. Now, if you ask objectivism in contrast, why is the universe orderly? Well, if you understand the relation of causality to identity and identity to existence, you will see that the answer is simply the universe is orderly because it exists. In sum, as far as metaphysics is concerned, the law of identity guarantees that there will be an external reality which is what it is and which is orderly and lawful. Now, what I want to do is point out some of the specifically epistemological roles of the law of identity in the objectivist philosophy. And my first theme will be the law of identity as the link between existence and consciousness. The law of identity as the link between existence and consciousness. For objectivism, the law of identity is at once the basic law of existence and the basic rule of logic. And it's the latter because it's the former. It's the basic fact of existence and therefore the fact to which we must adhere in our thinking if we are to achieve knowledge of existence. As Ayn Rand puts it, the law of identity in this respect is the link between metaphysics and epistemology. It's the basic principle of metaphysics and therefore the controlling principle of epistemology. It's the bridge between existence and consciousness. And there are at least two distinguishable ways in which it is this bridge or link between the two. First, the law of identity enables us to specify the function of consciousness. And here I speak on the conceptual level. The law of identity enables us to specify what is it that consciousness can hope to acquire as far as gaining knowledge of reality is concerned. What in the most basic sense is there to know? What can knowledge consist of? And here the crucial formulation is Ayn Rand's: existence is identity, consciousness is identification. In other words, all that a consciousness can do, here we're speaking on the post-perceptual level, all that a consciousness can do is to discover the identity of that which exists. There's only one fundamental question that a consciousness can ask, namely, what is it, whatever the X happens to be that you're talking about. Every other question is reducible to the question, what is the identity of something? If you ask why, you are asking what is the identity of the cause. If you ask how, you are asking what is the identity of the process by which something occurs. If you ask when, you are asking what is the identity of the time. Who, what is the identity of the person, etc. In this sense, consciousness is only the capacity for identification. You see here again the primacy of existence approach. Existence is identity. Well, then consciousness can be only awareness of identity. In other words, a process of identification. Well, this is one way in which the law of identity is the link between existence and consciousness. It's the fact of existence which sets the task of consciousness. And now, a second way in which it's this link, and here we get to logic more specifically, the law of identity specifies the rule, the method that human consciousness has to follow in making its identifications. Because A is A, we have to then make all of our identifications on that basis, which means never identify something as A and at the same time and in the same respect as non-A. In other words, don't be contradictory. And thus we reach logic, which Ayn Rand defines, you know, as the art of non-contradictory identification, which means simply the art of identifying things on the basis of the law of identity. And notice that both aspects in this definition are dictated by the law of identity. Both the identification, the goal, and the non-contradictory, the method, Both of them depend upon ASA. ASA sets the task of consciousness and the basic principle of method which it has to follow in order to achieve successfully its task. In this sense, the law of identity is the fundamental fact of existence and the controlling principle of epistemology, the link between the two. Now, I may note that this definition of logic as the art of identifying on the basis of ASA is extremely important, because what it does is provide a metaphysical validation of logic. Logic, like just about everything else in philosophy, has been corrupted by the primacy of consciousness. And you can see that simply if you just look at what some other theories have been. If you ask the typical Platonist Christian, why be logical? Why is logic valid? His ultimate answer, assuming he is in favor of logic, will be, well, because that's the way God thinks. The laws of logic are embedded in God's mind, and therefore we should follow them. If you ask a Kantian, why be logical? He says, well, that's the way the human mind is built. That's the subjective structure of man's mind. If you ask a pragmatist or positivist, he says, well, that's how people use words. That's what we find convenient to accept the law of identity. Now, in contrast to all of this, objectivism, you see, provides a primacy of existence, validation for logic. Why be logical according to objectivism? Because existence is identity. Because to be is to be something. And therefore, if you want to know existence, you have to adhere to its laws in your thinking. Logic is simply the method of thought in accordance with the basic laws of reality. Now, I should note that, to be fair on this question, Aristotle does hold the primacy of existence view as far as logic is concerned. But the issue is not fully satisfactory as it stands in the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle himself did not state the law of identity. He only stated the law of contradiction and the law of excluded middle. And although his followers did state the law of identity, they tended to rest the ultimate validity of logic on the law of contradiction, not on the law of identity. And for this reason, they did not make fully clear the actual metaphysical basis of logic. Because, you see, the law of contradiction is not the fundamental law. The fundamental law, the metaphysical law, is the law of identity. The law of contradiction and all other derivative laws from it is simply an epistemological restatement of the law of identity. It tells you, in effect, since A is A, since that's the fact of reality, then don't hold contradictions, or else you're wrong. You've made a mistake. But the reason for the law of contradiction, the reason it's true, is because a contradiction would annihilate the identity of the thing. If it's A and non-A, the two halves mutually annihilate each other, and the thing emerges as nothing. The fact of reality is A is A. There's no such thing as non-contradictoriness as a distinct attribute of existence over and above the fact that things are what they are. And in this sense, the actual metaphysical foundation of logic is the one law, the law of identity. Now, to my knowledge, Ayn Rand is the first one, clearly and unequivocally, to base logic on the law of identity. And in this sense, the first one, clearly and unequivocally, to give a metaphysical validation of logic. Now, before we leave the issue of A as the bridge between metaphysics and epistemology, I want to say a word or two about one other issue which is worth noting here. And that's how do you start a philosophy from a different aspect than the way we've looked at it so far. There's been a debate throughout the history of philosophy over the question, when you start to develop a philosophy systematically, which do you begin with, metaphysics or epistemology? And each side has given what seem to be very plausible arguments why you must start with metaphysics or why you must start with epistemology. One side argues epistemology must come first. They say, how can you know anything about reality until you have validated some method of arriving at knowledge, until you have some principles of knowledge to guide you? But of course, the question arises, how do you validate the method, the principles you use, except by reference to some facts of reality? That you say this method is right because it's based on certain principles of reality. And therefore the other side says we have to start with metaphysics. We have to start with principles of reality and then subsequently develop principles of epistemology. To which the other side comes back and says, but how do you know what's a fact, what are principles of reality before you have a method? You see, and it seesaws back and forth. And the question, therefore, is that's been raised by many philosophers, where do you start? With a fact of existence or principle of method? Well, you should see now, simply in a sentence, what the objectivist answer is. The two start simultaneously. Neither starts before the other, for the very reason that the basic law of existence is the basic rule of human knowledge. The basic law of existence is the basic principle of the method of knowledge. The basic law of metaphysics is the basic law of epistemology. And therefore we don't have the problem of which comes before which in the act of stating A as A. We have simultaneously laid down the foundation of metaphysics and the controlling principle of epistemology. Now we're talking about the role of the law of identity in epistemology. And I have one last but very, very crucial fact about the role of the law of identity in epistemology from the point of view of objectivism. Up to now I've been talking of the law of identity as applicable to existence. Now I want to apply it to consciousness. Observe here that consciousness also exists, and therefore it also has identity. It also is something. Now traditionally this has been considered to be a great problem by the great majority of philosophers. Well, what problem, you ask? Well, they say if consciousness is something, if it has a specific nature, if it has specific means of knowledge, then it can only acquire its knowledge in a specific way, and it has to hold its knowledge in a specific form. Well, then they say no one can ever perceive or be aware of reality directly, as it really is in itself. Now let's elaborate this so-called problem. And let's confine ourselves for now to the question of sense perception. Although I note that the issue is wider than sense perception because it applies on the conceptual level also, as we'll see next week. The problem is supposed to be this. We're going to confine ourselves now to the sense perception. Since our consciousness is something, we perceive by means of specific sensory organs. If we had different sensory apparatus, our perceptions would be different. And this is obviously true as far as it goes. Now you can hypothesize, for instance, another species of being, a living conscious being, which has radically different sensory apparatus than human beings, because there's nothing to say that the human mode of sense perception is the only mode of sense perception possible in the universe. So let your imaginations run wild and imagine some kind of Martian which does not have eyes and ears and so on, but don't ask me what, because I've never met such a creature and wouldn't know what his experience is like, but suppose that he experiences the world in terms of buzzes and twitches, or rather than in the forms that we do. His particular form of awareness is determined by his particular organs of perception. Now, the traditional philosopher comes in and says, well, such a thing is possible. And what can we say then but that each of us only experiences the effects of reality on us after it's been processed by our particular sensory apparatus. We see the world as human beings have to, given the human organs of perception. The Martian gets a Martian's eye perspective, etc. But they say nobody really can know what's out there really in itself. We're debarred from access to reality. Every consciousness, they conclude, is really locked up in itself. Perception is really introspection. All we really are doing is looking in at the content of our own consciousness, because we're at the end of the chain after this processing takes place. In sum, this particular approach to philosophy says, since human consciousness has a definite nature, it can't escape that nature, and therefore we can't claim to perceive things, quote, as they really are in themselves. Now, as against that, there is another approach in the history of philosophy which says, well, okay, if that's the case, we're going to take the bull by the horns and say consciousness has no nature. It has no identity, and therefore contributes nothing whatever to our experience. And there have been realists in the history of philosophy, and in passages, Aristotle seems to be one of them, who hold that in order to escape this problem, that consciousness has identity and therefore doesn't perceive things as they really are, that the only way out is to say consciousness in itself has no identity. It's nothing in particular, and therefore it doesn't distort us. To which, of course, the obvious question is, if it's nothing in particular, how can it be at all? And how do you account for the obvious facts that insofar as people's sensory apparatus varies, their perceptions vary? You know the classic case of the colorblind man who perceives the green table as gray, etc. Now, if consciousness has no identity, if it has no nature, how can we account for the fact of varying perceptions? Now, between these two different approaches, there is, however, one common principle that they both agree to. If consciousness has identity, then it can't perceive reality. And then they simply take the two different sides of that. One side says it has identity, therefore it doesn't perceive reality. The other side says, yes, it can perceive reality, therefore it has no identity. Now, both of these theories constitute an attack on the existence of consciousness as such. Both of them, regardless of what they state, amount to a denial of the existence of consciousness. Both imply the view that consciousness, and I here now speak of any type of consciousness, from the amoeba on up through God, if he existed. Both of them imply that consciousness of any type is impossible. And you can see this easily enough in both of these approaches. One of them states, yes, there's consciousness, but it's not aware of existence. Now that is obviously a contradiction, because there's nothing else to perceive but existence. A consciousness not conscious of existence would be conscious of non-existence. In other words, of nothing. In other words, it would be unconscious. In other words, it wouldn't exist. Remember the crucial point. Consciousness is the faculty of perceiving that which exists. There's nothing else to perceive. I remind you of one crucial line from Galt's speech, quote, if that which you claim to perceive does not exist, what you possess is not consciousness. So this school, this approach, which says consciousness has a specific nature, therefore it doesn't perceive reality, clearly is a denial of the very possibility of consciousness. The other side even more obviously denies the existence of consciousness, because it says, yes, consciousness does perceive existence, but because it has no identity. In other words, it has no nature, no specific means or organs of perception. It's nothing in particular. In other words, it's nothing. But if it's nothing, it doesn't exist. One school says consciousness is something, therefore it can't exist. And the other school says consciousness exists, therefore it's nothing. It can't exist. Now, common to both of these theories, and they have fought all the way through the history of philosophy, is the following premise. because consciousness is something, because it has specific means of perception, perception is impossible. As Ayn Rand puts it, it's paraphrasing her, it's because you have eyes that you can't see things. It's because you have ears that you can't hear the way things really are. It's because you have specific organs of perception that perception is impossible. The basic self-contradiction in both of these approaches is this: only if consciousness were nothing, in particular, in other words, nothing, could it exist. Now, what in contrast is the objectivist position? Well, it's the exact opposite of that. Here we confine ourselves to sense perception this evening, but much of what we say will be applicable to concept formation. Objectivism holds that consciousness is consciousness of reality, of existence, because there's nothing else to be conscious of, as we've seen. And in this sense, all sense perception is valid, necessarily valid. An invalid sense perception for objectivism would be literally a contradiction in terms. Because an invalid sense perception would be one which is not a perception of reality. But if it's a sense perception, it must be a perception of reality. There's nothing else to perceive. Consequently, according to objectivism, since consciousness is consciousness of existence, every sense perception is valid. But we now add, consciousness can perceive only in a specific form. A form which is dictated by its particular means of perception. There is no such thing as perceiving know-how. If you perceive somehow, by some means, and therefore in some specific form, a form which will be dictated by your particular means of perception. So, for instance, you perceive light waves reflected from the surface of an object. You perceive them by means of your eyes, and therefore in the form of color. You perceive certain vibrations in the air by means of your ears, and therefore in the form of sound. We perceive energy states of various molecular combinations by certain receptors in the skin, that's the means, and therefore we perceive it in the form of heat, and so on. In all cases, we have to make a crucial distinction between the object of the perception and the form of the perception. In all cases, the object of our perception, what we are perceiving, is a fact out there, a fact of reality. But in all cases, we are perceiving it by a certain means and therefore in a certain form. Now, the opponents of this view say if you perceive it by a certain means, if you perceive it in a certain form, then you're not perceiving it. In other words, they say possession of means is incompatible with perceiving. Objectivism says the exact opposite. It says only the existence of certain means makes consciousness possible. The fact that a consciousness has to perceive in a specific form doesn't invalidate it. That's what makes it possible. Summarize it like this. The opposing schools say identity is the obstacle to the perception of reality. Objectivism says only because consciousness has identity can it perceive at all. And since this is true, we have to always distinguish in any process of knowledge the object, what we know, which will always be reality, and the how, the means, the form in which we know it. And the form will be a function of the identity of the consciousness perceiving. But all forms of perception are forms of perception. In other words, they're forms of awareness of reality. And as such, all of them are valid, and there is no philosophic problem here. Now, what I've given you so far is the fundamental answer to the major attacks on the validity of the senses. But to make it fully clear, I want to briefly indicate the answer to one question that's commonly raised in this connection when someone hears the objectivist view on this question. It's commonly asked, well, if two different consciousnesses perceive the same object, you say, they perceive the same object in different forms, doesn't that imply a contradiction between them? And then the classic example you'll be given is the normal man, the man with normal vision looks at this table and he says, it's green. And the colorblind man comes up and he says, it's gray. And the question is, well, isn't that a contradiction? Isn't one of them right and the other one wrong? And the answer is no. They're both right. There is no contradiction between the two. No contradiction between one form of perception and another is logically possible. Now consider this. When a person says this is green, what is he validly entitled to mean by his statement? What is he validly entitled to? Now he's got to recognize that he's perceiving the object in a specific form, which is a function of his particular means of perception. He can't illegitimately evade the issue of means and pretend that he has some mystic revelation from the object and that the nature of his means of perception is irrelevant. So what can he validly mean by saying it's green? Well, in pattern this, it's an entity in reality of a specific nature such that when it acts upon my senses, I perceive it in the form of a green color. And that's true. That is what it is. Now the colorblind man comes along and he says, it's gray. Now by the same reasoning, what is he entitled to mean by his statement? It's an entity in reality of a specific nature, such that when it acts upon my senses, I perceive it in the form of a gray color. And that is true. That is also what it is. Both of these are true statements. Neither conflicts with the other, neither contradicts the other. In other words, each of them has to recognize that their perceptions are valid perceptions of reality. They're not subjective inventions. Neither of them has any choice about the nature of the sense perceptions. Each of their perceptions is an inexorably determined effect caused by an object in reality acting on their particular organs of perception. If they properly define what they're entitled to say, there's no contradiction at all in the fact that different consciousnesses have different forms of perception. Where does even the appearance of contradiction come in? Well, only if one of them thinks, I somehow have a mystical contact with reality. I see it without benefit of sense organs. I just wrap my consciousness around the object, so to speak, and see it, quote, really, and everybody else is wrong. Only if he takes this view do you have the trouble. But this view is illegitimate. So I summarize this question as follows. All forms of sense perception are necessarily valid. No contradictions are possible among them. And all perceivers, regardless of the differences in form, perceive reality. Well, have we now finished with the question of the validity of the senses? Not quite. Because there's one final distinction that I want to mention now. That's a distinction that is vital for thoroughly understanding the issue of sense perception. And I may say, to anticipate next week, it also has enormous importance in understanding many other aspects of the objectivist philosophy, particularly the theory of concepts and the objectivist ethics. I want to introduce you to a distinction that is crucially important to objectivist epistemology, and that is completely distinctive to it. It has, to my knowledge, no precursors in the history of philosophy. It is to epistemology what the primacy of existence is to metaphysics, a fundamental, distinctive element in objectivism that runs right through. I'm going to introduce it to you tonight on the basis of the question of sense perception, and then we'll see next week how it runs through the rest of epistemology and ethics. Now, to introduce you to this distinction, I ask you, what would you say if someone had heard my discussion up to now and he came and he asked this question? He said, what is the metaphysical status of the sensory qualities that you perceive? Take, for instance, particular examples: color, warmth, loudness, etc. Now, commonly you will be asked, in effect, where are they? That's what we mean by their metaphysical status. Are they out there in reality? Are they intrinsic in things, independent of the existence of any consciousness? That's one possibility you'll be confronted. Well, you'll say to yourself, if, as in this case, color, warmth, and so on, if these are a function of our form of perception, I can't make them independent of consciousness. So you'll say that doesn't seem that could be a right answer to the question. Well, the person will then immediately come back to you and say, well then, color, warmth, and all these qualities are simply in here, simply subjective. If they're not out there, they must be in here. If they're not intrinsic in reality, they must just be subjective contents of the human mind. Now again, you would say, no. When I perceive color, I'm perceiving reality. I'm looking out. I'm perceiving a fact. I'm not introspecting a subjective experience. Now you see, the two alternatives that you have been given are not sufficient. There must be a third category, a third type of metaphysical status, because neither of the two that I've mentioned so far fits the status of qualities like color, warmth, and so on. And yet, traditionally in the history of philosophy, these are the only two alternatives that you are offered regarding the status of sensory qualities. Traditionally, you're given two choices. A certain sensory quality is either out there or it's in here. It's either real or it's subjective. Really there or just a subjective creation or product or deception or whichever of consciousness. And then given this twofold category to work with, just these two possibilities, the schools of sense perception proceed to align themselves according to how they apportion the various qualities. One school, which calls itself naive realism, to which Aristotle is partially a member, says all the qualities we perceive are out there in reality independent of us. On the other side is someone like Bishop Berkeley, sort of subjective idealism, who says all of the qualities are simply subjective experiences in our own consciousness. And then, of course, there are, in effect, the Republicans of sense perception, who say some of them are out there and some of them are in here. And that would be represented by Descartes and Locke, among others. Now, objectivism, as I indicated, holds that these twofold alternative does not cover the facts. A threefold distinction is necessary if we are to make sense of this question and of many other questions. A trichotomy, if you want to use the word, between three types of metaphysical status, which we call the subjective, the intrinsic, and the objective. The subjective, the intrinsic, and the objective. Now let me explain these three. By subjective, in this connection, we mean any phenomenon which is solely a function of consciousness. Anything which exists in and only as a state of consciousness. Anything which pertains to or is a product of consciousness, quite apart from any relation which consciousness has to existence at that moment. Now, if you want an example of a subjective phenomenon by this definition, imagine the hallucination of a pink rat. which is simply a product of consciousness cut off from existence, a barrier between you and existence. Now I say, strictly speaking, even that pink rat is not entirely subjective, because obviously you had to have some contact with reality to get the awareness of rats, so you could even, under an intoxicated state, reach the phenomenon of a pink rat. But at the moment, there is no tie between that pink rat and reality. It simply is a product of consciousness cut off entirely from reality. And in that sense, at the moment, it is a strictly subjective phenomenon. So the subjective, for short, is the just in here, cut off from the out there. Now, what is the intrinsic? The intrinsic means that which exists metaphysically. That which is an inherent attribute of existence quite apart from any relation to consciousness. That which is an inherent attribute of existence quite apart from any relationship to consciousness. And we know that there must be some intrinsic attributes of existence, because after all, A is A, reality exists, it's something apart from us. Now, what they are is not the province of philosophy to discuss, but for instance, light waves, atomic weights, energy, and so on. The intrinsic means, for short, putting it crudely, the out there only, the out there apart from the in here. And now we get to the third and crucial category, the objective. Now, as I'm using that here, that designates a particular type of metaphysical status, which is neither subjective nor intrinsic. A phenomenon is objective when it arises from a particular consciousness's form of perceiving existence. A phenomenon is objective when it involves both consciousness and existence. When something results from a consciousness of a certain kind, perceiving reality in a form inherent in that consciousness, the resultant phenomenon is neither subjective nor intrinsic. It's neither just in here, subjective, like a hallucination which cuts you off from reality, nor is it simply out there, intrinsic, because after all, it arises from the fact that the consciousness has a certain form. It's the product of a consciousness of a certain sort perceiving existence. So if you want to put it in a simple, non-elegant, but I think clear formulation, the objective is the out there as perceived by the in here, or existence as perceived by consciousness. Now I hope you get this threefold distinction. That which belongs exclusively to consciousness, the subject. That which belongs exclusively to existence, the intrinsic. And that which arises from the perception of existence by a certain type of consciousness, the object. And now observe what happens if you don't make this distinction within the realm, now just for this evening, of sense perception. But take the school such as the naive realists. They make all sense qualities intrinsic. They say that warmth, color, taste, you name it, all of them are intrinsic features of reality, entirely independent of human consciousness. In other words, they do not take into account the fact that perception is perception in some form as a result, in this case, of the nature of human consciousness. They are consequently put in the position of saying that in the case of the man who says it's green and the man who says it's gray, one of them must be wrong. They are necessarily put in that position because they regard the phenomenon in question as intrinsic. In other words, the view that these sense qualities are intrinsic leads to the view that they can contradict each other. And thus the naive realists concede the possibility that there can be such a thing as an invalid sense perception. And once they say that, of course, all is lost. Because they tell you, in effect, if your sense organ has a certain structure, it may deceive you. And then, of course, the question is, well, how do you know when it has the right structure? Well, they shortly discover you can't go by majority rule. Pretty soon the reports come in that everybody's sensed organs affect the type of experience he has. And they throw up their hands, become disillusioned, and turn skeptical. The fact is they don't distinguish between the objective perception and the form of perception. They take a phenomenon which is derivative from the form of perception and they make it intrinsic to the object. Now, objectivism does not hold that such qualities as I've here mentioned are intrinsic. But it doesn't follow from this warmth, color, and so on, assuming that these are on the side of form. It does not follow that they are therefore, in any sense, in the metaphysical status of a hallucination. That they are subjective or unreal or arbitrary inventions or deceptions or distortions which are just in consciousness and which constitute obstacles or blocks to your perception of reality. When you perceive any one of these qualities, you are not simply introspecting subjective content. The whole point is that while the qualities I've mentioned are not intrinsic in things, while they derive from the human form of perception, the form is the form of perceiving reality. So that these are not inventions of consciousness that you contrast with perceiving reality. They represent forms of perceiving reality. Forms inexorably dictated by the nature of that object as perceived by a certain type of consciousness. Now, the best term, you see, to designate such a phenomenon is that it is neither intrinsic nor subjective, but objective. So if somebody asks you about red, the color red, is it subjective or intrinsic? The answer would be it's neither. It's not subjective. It's not an invention. It's not arbitrary. It's not a deception. In a crucial sense, it is out there. When you perceive red, you are perceiving something out there. In this case, say light waves reflected from a given surface. But you are perceiving it in a certain form, which is dictated by your means of perception. And therefore you cannot say this particular quality is intrinsic. In other words, we can distinguish the form from the object, but this does not invalidate the form of perception. And we cover this point by distinguishing the objective from the subjective on the one hand and the intrinsic on the other. You can think of it this way. The category of the objective, as distinct from these other two, arises from the combination of two crucial tenets in objectivism. One is that consciousness is the faculty of perceiving existence. The other, that consciousness has identity. The combination of those two tenets yields the category of the objective. Since consciousness is the faculty of perceiving existence, then, if it's correctly functioning, its contents will not be subjective. It's the faculty of perceiving existence. On the other hand, since consciousness has identity, and it perceives in a certain form, therefore, some phenomena will arise from the fact that it has identity. And therefore it can't be that everything is intrinsic. And consequently there must be a category which is neither the subjective nor the intrinsic, and that is the objective. Now this threefold distinction in metaphysical status is central to the objectivist approach, as I say, in a great many issues other than sense perception. In a great many issues, traditional philosophers will point to some phenomenon which is clearly on the side of form. And this is much broader than simply sense perception. Some phenomenon which arises from the fact that human consciousness has a specific identity. And they will ask, is it intrinsic? Is it out there? And the answer will obviously be no. They'll conclude, well, then it's simply subjective. And of course, once they say it's subjective, that means it's deuce is wild, it's arbitrary, and anything goes. They omit the category of the objective entirely, and the result is epistemological havoc and catastrophe. And a few better old-fashioned philosophers left who try to oppose subjectivism, in the typical case, don't know what to do except to hold out for the things being intrinsic, which in a great many cases it obviously isn't. Now, what we want to do next week is see how this trichotomy applies to the issue of concepts and then to the issue of values. And once you have a number of instances, you'll be able to more easily abstract the general principle and see the distinctiveness of the objectivist approach. All right, we will conclude here for this evening and pick up with the objectivist theory of concepts and the objectivist ethics next week. Thank you. Please prove the existence of free will. And here's another one. Please prove free will. All right. You begin by specifying what free will consists of. For objectivism, free will does not consist of the ability to take uncaused action. It does not consist of the ability to will uncaused emotions. It does not consist of the ability to come to conclusions arbitrarily, directly by an act of will. For objectivism, your actions derive from your conclusions, from your value judgments, and the particular conclusions that you come to once you decide to think are also determined by many factors, by the state of the evidence, by your knowledge, your intelligence, and so on. You do not, free will does not mean you simply have the ability to grab a hold of any conclusion and believe it by an act of will. You cannot now, for instance, no matter what exercise you make of your free will, get yourself to believe that 2 and 2 equals 5. You can get yourself to mouth it, but you can get yourself to believe it, given your state of knowledge. So that once an individual chooses to think, then the evidence available and his knowledge and his intelligence and so on determines the conclusions that he comes to, and the conclusions that he comes to, including his value conclusions, determine the actions that he takes. The entire chain is causally determined. Where does the question of free will come in? Well, as I indicated in the lecture, in one basic choice, namely the choice to think or not, to focus on facts or not, to put forth the effort or simply to let your mind go blank and idle in a daze, to focus on facts or give in to emotions, to focus on the actual facts of a question, give in to social pressures, etc. This, and this alone, according to objectivism, is the basic area of choice which you have. And since that's the basic choice, and everything else flows from it, you're responsible for all the consequences because you are responsible for this primary choice. Now, you must understand, of course, that according to objectivism, it's not as though you make this choice to think or not on Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock and then that's it for the rest of your life. You have the chance to make this choice at each instant that you are awake, and you can always reverse any preceding choice. Now, why do we say that this is an actual free choice? That it's not a product of your environment, your heredity, your emotions, your God, or anything else, but simply your act of choice? Well, in essence, the answer is because that is inherent in the fact of being a fallible being who has to engage in a certain validating process to acquire knowledge. You can look at it like this. Human beings are fallible. They're capable of error. They are not automatically processed in such a way that whatever conclusion they come up with is automatically correct. If human beings were infallible, if they couldn't make errors, there would be no argument in favor of free will. if you took a UNIVAC machine that was programmed in such a way that it was absolutely infallible and couldn't go wrong, then the fact that it was determined, there'd be no objection to it. It could still rely on the conclusions that came out of it because nothing can go wrong in the process. But now I ask you to imagine a UNIVAC machine which is such that there's a little lever inside. And this lever can go one or the other of two ways. When this lever goes down, the conclusions that come out are correctly processed. When this lever goes up, the conclusions that come out are distorted or aberrated or false. And it's not automatic. Sometimes the lever goes up and sometimes it goes down. Now I put it to you that in such a case, if the UNIVAC, assuming the UNIVAC were conscious just for purposes of this example, if this machine did not have control over the exercise of this lever, it could know nothing. It could trust absolutely no conclusion that came up at the end of this chain because it knows there is something inside this mechanism that can go wrong, that can derail it entirely, and it does not have control over the exercise of this crucial factor. Now, the parallel in the case of human beings is this. We're capable of error, so we are not built in such a way that we're automatically correct. We must engage in a certain validating process, a certain process of thought, a certain process of using logic in order to know that our conclusions are correct. We do not use logic automatically. This is obvious in the fact that there are a great many people who don't use it. So you can't say human beings are built in such a way that they automatically function logically. And yet, functioning logically is a precondition of being able to rely on their conclusions since they're fallible. Now in that setup, given those conditions, if human beings are not free in the exercise of logic, if they are not free to initiate the process of thought, if when they think that's a product of forces outside their control, and when they evade or give in to emotions or ignore facts, that's necessitated by forces outside their control, then they're in the position of that machine with the lever. They cannot trust anything that comes out of their consciousness because they know their consciousness is not automatically right. It depends upon a certain process and they have no control over the exercise of this process. This is why the bare minimum that free will must consist of is the choice to think or not, to exercise the logical validating mechanism or not. If you don't have that choice and you are a fallible being, the result would be complete skepticism. You could know nothing. But you know that complete skepticism is a self-contradiction. It's a denial of the existence of consciousness because a skeptic is someone who says knowledge is impossible, nobody can be conscious of reality. Consequently, I would simply say, to summarize, the proof of free will is simply that it is a consequence of, it's inherent in the fact that human beings are conscious and that they are fallible and therefore require control over the mechanism which alone validates their conclusions. Now the question arises, well, but how do you reconcile free will with cause and effect? Now, I indicated in the lecture that that question is itself in fact, not a valid question if it implies that there's a conflict between the two, but let's spell it out just a little bit. The law of cause and effect states that every entity has a certain nature, and under certain circumstances will have to act in a certain way as a result of its particular nature. Notice the law of cause and effect does not tell you. The law of cause and effect itself does not tell you what type of actions or processes there are in the universe. It does not prohibit any particular type of process or action. It doesn't tell you that there is or isn't eating, running, sleeping, etc. It simply says wherever you have an entity of a particular nature, it has to act in a certain way, perform a certain type of process, and it can't escape that type of action, that type of process in those circumstances. Now, the simple fact is only choosing is a certain type of process, a certain type of action. Human beings have a specific nature, given a brain, consciousness of a certain type, a nervous system, and so on. And that type of entity, given its particular nature, its particular characteristics, can do nothing but take that particular type of action, namely choose. You have no choice about whether you will choose. Your choosing as a type of action is entirely necessitated by your nature as a particular type of entity, just as the falling of that cigarette when I let it go is entirely necessitated by its nature. Now, one interesting example of this is the existentialist wail that we saw last week, that they cannot escape the fact of choice, you see, which is just simply an eloquent indication of the fact that choosing is necessitated by your particular nature. Now, that is all the law of cause and effect requires, that a certain type of action be necessitated by the nature of the entity in question. It doesn't prohibit such an action as choosing if you have an entity such as man, which has that particular type of nature. Consequently, there is no problem in reconciling free will and cause and effect. Now, while we're no, you took me off. Can the existence of free will be known introspectively? If so, is that sufficient proof of free will? Well, the existence of free will can, of course, be, in one sense, detected introspectively. That is, you can simply observe the fact that at any moment you have the choice to focus your consciousness or not. You can, right at this moment, deliberately put yourself out of focus, turn your attention away, blur what I'm saying so it comes as just a hodgepodge of words, and then you can in the next moment sharpen it again and suddenly it comes into clear focus. In this sense, you can directly experience it. I do not, however, regard that as a proof of free will, because if you simply rely on this introspective experience, the door is still open for a determinist to say, well, all you're observing is that you do this and then you do that. You are not observing that it is free as distinct from a previously necessitated choice. And the standard determinist answer to introspection is you are simply not aware of the antecedent external factors which is necessitating you at one moment to focus and the other moment not to. And I think, therefore, that if you want to give a full proof of free will, you must do more than simply introspect. You must validate your introspection by showing that if you do not interpret what you introspect as authentically free, you are in the position of invalidating human consciousness altogether. Now, this question goes on, doesn't free will involve the capacity to act as well as to think? Would you clarify this? Yes, of course it involves the capacity to act, but only as a consequence of the conclusions you come to. And there's a difference in the exercise of free will as it applies to action than as it applies to thought. You cannot directly will an action independent of any evaluative conclusions, any intellectual content, any mental thought process. You could not, for instance, with all the free will in the world, suddenly decide out of the blue to leap out the window and go to the ground. You just cannot do that. In order to take that action, you have to come to certain conclusions, such as, at minimum, for instance, that you're in a big rush to get downstairs and you're willing to pay any price to get there. Or more likely that you've had enough of life and this is a quick way of ending it or whichever. Free will does not involve the ability directly to will an action. An action always presupposes some value conclusions that you have come to. Now, of course, you have the experience that you directly will an action because at a certain point you have reached a whole variety of value conclusions. And you are in control of what your consciousness will focus on. That's your area of free will. So in the moment of focusing on any particular value, then of course the action will immediately follow from that. And therefore there is a sense in which you directly choose your actions. The only point I make is that it's not the same sense in which you directly choose to initiate the process of focus or awareness. This latter is the really primary source of free will. Everything else is a derivative of that particular choice. Now I have a question here that's on cause and effect that was submitted, if I remember, around the third week in this course, and I have religiously carried it around week after week thinking I would have to get to it, and now, since it's on the causal principle, I hope the person is still here, but I want to answer it at least briefly. It refers back to the lecture in which I gave the proof of causality, and the person says as follows. In your proof of the causal principle, doesn't the premise the kind of action an entity performs depend on the kind of entity it is? Doesn't that beg the question? For it assumes that the traditional objections to causal necessity have been answered. For instance, we say that if we release a cigarette in the air, it is necessary that it falls, because in the nature of things, all things that are heavier than air fall. But how can we establish this? For the principle that all things heavier than air fall has simply been verified by experience in some instances and not in all possible experiences. This, of course, is simply a form of the Humean criticism. If, on the other hand, we say that all things heavier than air will in fact fall, even though we haven't experienced all instances of things falling, how can we claim to know this? Isn't this a claim of omniscience? You get that question? And I thought that was sufficiently interesting so that it's all battered now, but I've carried it for weeks trying to get a chance to say something on this. And here I say an answer. You must make a clear distinction between two different questions. The metaphysical question and the epistemological question. The metaphysical question is, can you prove that there is a law of cause and effect? The epistemological question is, how do you know in any particular case that you have correctly arrived at a law of reality and not been taken in by a coincidence? Now, in my proof of the law of cause and effect, I did not rely as a premise on the assumption that I already knew in advance any particular law of reality, any scientific or empirical law of reality. The argument is simply this. You can't have actions without the entity which acts. Entities have a specific nature, A as A. If the same entity, under the same circumstances, had contradictory capacities, that means it could do A, and the same entity, under the same circumstances, could do non-A, then, if what it can do depends upon what it is, it would have to have contradictory attributes to give rise to those contradictory capacities, and A as A prohibits them. Now, I did use the example of the cigarette falling, but that was simply to illustrate the point. You don't need an illustration for the proof. The proof rests exclusively upon two premises. Entities are the things that act, actions are actions of entities, and A as A. And that establishes cause and effect without yet assuming that we know any particular law of nature. Now, the second and quite different question is, assuming the law of cause and effect, assuming that there are laws of nature, how do you know in any particular case that you have correctly arrived at a law of nature? Do you have to experience every possible instance before you can arrive with certainty, and before you can claim with certainty that you know a particular scientific law, such as that all things heavier than air fall, or all men are mortal, all alcohol in certain quantities intoxicates, etc. Now, this is an epistemological question, not a metaphysical one. It takes for granted that there are laws of nature, and then asks how do we validate our knowledge of laws in a particular case. Now, officially I've answered the question simply because I say the question confuses the epistemological with the metaphysical question. What's really being raised here is the problem of induction. How do you know when you have generalized correctly? Now, it's not possible in a question period or even in a lecture simply to give anything like an answer to that. I'll simply point out to you, if you a few relevant facts. For one thing, I would say, obviously, it depends upon, in other words, your confidence in your generalization depends upon the kind of sample which you have. Depends upon the kind of instances from which you're generalizing, and that's obviously relevant. Here's a simple case. Take all men are mortal. If I give you 100 men, all of them born in Brooklyn, live in Brooklyn, all of them with blonde hair, all of them engineers, all of them devotees of Hegel, and I find that they're all mortal. Or I give you 100 men spread across the whole globe with different professions, different color hair, different philosophies, etc., and you find that they're all mortal. In which case are you in a better position to generalize? Obviously in the second case, even though in both cases you have 100 instances. Because in the first case, you leave open the possibility that the mortality derives not from the fact that they're human, but from the fact that they live in Brooklyn, or that they're followers of Hegel, or that they have blonde hair, or whatever it happens to be. In the second case, if your sample is properly selected, then you deliberately choose people in which every possible candidate for an explanation of mortality is canceled out by other members of the sample, so that all that's left is something inherent in being human. Now I say, when you have a situation like that, where the representatives, the sample is such that there is nothing left but one common denominator that could possibly account for the effect, then you are in a position to say that all men are mortal. And I think in the case of all men are mortal, on that count alone, we have such a fantastic variety of men who have died from every possible persuasion and so on and so on, that I say, if anybody says that he is not sure of that, and he hasn't had enough evidence, let him put forth another possibility that's common to everybody who's died besides the fact that they're human. But now over and above that, there are other tests that you use. Now I hope you don't think I'm giving you a definitive course on the problem of induction now, but I'm just tossing out a few possible leads. There's other tests besides the sort of sample that you use. For instance, can you integrate your generalization with other relevant knowledge? Now, for instance, in the case of all men are mortal, you have the whole set of observations from the fact that all living beings are mortal, from all other living species. And consequently, you have a whole vast array of supporting evidence over and above just what you have from the observation that all men are mortal. On the other hand, suppose it's been the case that every crow we've ever seen has been black, and we have literally zillions and zillions and zillions of crows from all over the world, and we never found one that wasn't black. I would say, by the test of integration with other knowledge, that generalization is in a much worse state and is much more precarious, and I would never claim certainty about such a proposition as all crows are black, because we know, integrating with other knowledge, the fact that color is the most variable attribute of a species, and it has the least connection with the structure of the species, and that in species after species, the color can vary, while the rest of the attributes remain essentially the same. We know that there's such things as albinos in various species. Now, given that knowledge, you could be hit over the head with 10 million black crows and say, I'm not yet convinced. If you're going to establish that all crows are, I was going to say mortal, are black, then you have to do more. You have to integrate it with some type of other knowledge. And that's another test that is very relevant in assessing the weight of a generalization. And there's still another point we could make that's relevant. Can you offer an explanation of the generalization? Can you show something about the nature of the entity, even if on a primitive level, that will tie the observed fact that you're trying to generalize into the nature of the entity? Now take again the proposition all men are mortal and consider it. these two cases. On the one hand, you have the case as it actually is now, where you observe, in the normal case, a man begins to age at a certain period, he begins to get weaker, his face begins to get lined, one organ after the other begins to go. Generally what we call the aging process sets in, and at a certain point, he dies. Now I say that is a different phenomenon than if, for instance, imagine the following. Imagine we had the same number of people and everything was the same, only it was the following science fiction situation. Everybody was in strapping, splendid health. And at the age of 35, without any indication of anything else, they suddenly drop dead. Now I'd say in a case like that, where you can't tie the fact to anything else about the nature of the entity, it's just a bolt from the blue and you haven't the beginnings of a connection to the nature of the entity, then you are not in the position yet to say this is necessarily true. Whereas in the case of all men are mortal, when you can see that as part of the very nature of the process which human beings go through, even if you have not yet explained the aging process, you have nevertheless tied that observation to the nature of the entity on one level. And when you can offer an explanation, even if a beginning of an explanation, then I say that is also a very relevant factor. So there are many other things, but I would summarize it like this. If you want to know, in a particular case, how do you know if you've generalized correctly? The question becomes, what kind of sample did you use? And there are many methods of determining representative samples. What is the state of your knowledge of your ability to explain what you have observed? What is its relationship to the rest of what you know that's relevant, your ability to integrate it to other knowledge? And if, as in the case of a generalization like all men are mortal, it comes out with flying colors on all these various counts, and I say, yes, you can know that with certainty, even though you have not and will not experience each and every man dying. Now that's a brief, I emphasize, indication only of some of the kinds of factors involved in validating inductive knowledge. I'll try to say something next week, either in the lecture or if not in the question period, about, well, how can you claim certainty, though? Because I want to say something about what is certainty from an objectivist point of view. But for tonight, that's all I'll say about that question. Now I have some more. Why is logic identified as an art rather than a science? It is a question of perspective. You could, in different contexts, identify logic as an art, a science, or a method, depending upon which aspect you were focusing on. If you think of logic simply as the rules that you have to follow in order to achieve a certain end, then the genus would be it's a method. If you think of the actual exercise, the practice of this method, then it's an art. If you think of the systematic presentation of all the principles of inference, starting from the basic one and showing how all the others follow from it, then you have a science, the science of the principles of inference, which is also called logic. So it's simply a question of which perspective do you have on it. Are you regarding it as a body of principles systematically interconnected? That's a science. Are you regarding it as a series of rules to guide human thinking? It's a method. Or are you thinking of the actual practice of those rules? Then it's an art. So there's nothing mysterious about that question. It's a matter of which perspective you take. Does the objectivist definition of an entity demand materiality? Would a thought or a state of consciousness fall under this class? I wouldn't go so far as to say demand materiality. What I would say is that in the strict sense, an entity is something capable of independent existence. An entity is something which can exist by itself. That's how you contrast an entity, for instance, with a quality, a relationship, an action, a quantity. A quality, for instance, like red or long or whichever, can't exist by itself, but must inhere in an entity. An action like moving can't exist by itself, but only as the action of an entity, and so on for relationship, quantity, and so on. An entity is the category of thing which can exist by itself, which is a self-enclosed phenomenon. In this sense, I would not necessarily want to say that all entities are material, because that would be a question of the ultimate nature of physical reality. And it would depend on, are you including energy in entities? And what is energy? And can there be entities comprised of energy? And I don't know any physicist that can answer this question, simply because I don't know any physicist that will tell you what energy is, as apart from giving you simply some formulas as to how to measure it, which is not the same thing as telling you what it is. But I would say a philosopher should not go into the realm of physics qua philosopher. I mean, he can if he wants to be a physicist on the side. But as a philosopher, he should not follow the primacy of consciousness and prescribe to reality what it must do. We have to have facts of reality to justify our conclusion. So much for the question of materiality. As far as a state of consciousness or a thought, that would not be an entity, obviously, in the strict sense that I have just been using. A state of consciousness is a faculty of a human being or an animal. It's a faculty of an entity. It's not an entity by itself. It cannot exist by itself, and neither, of course, can a thought, an emotion, etc. Now, sometimes the word entity is used more loosely to stand for a something, and not in the strict sense of a thing capable of independent existence. Now, in the sense of a something, then, of course, you could say consciousness is an entity, but then everything is an entity, because entity has become synonymous with identity. Now, just give me a second here. If all that we perceive is both a product of existence and of our specific means of perceiving it, then all which we perceive must be objective. What then would be an example of the intrinsic? Well, this, first of all, doesn't follow. We perceive reality in a certain form. It does not follow that everything we perceive is necessarily in the category of the objective as against the intrinsic. Now let me say in advance, it is not the function of philosophers to specify which qualities are intrinsic and which are objective, because there is no specific philosophic means to do that. If you want to know the physical nature of reality beyond the kind of broad principles that we discuss in philosophy, you have to have specific studies of physical reality, which is the province of the physical scientists. Consequently, it is not within the province of philosophy to take qualities and start apportioning them and say this group is in the side of the objective and this group is in the side of the intrinsic. We simply establish this much. Reality is something. It has some characteristics regardless of whoever perceives it. Whatever the characteristics are that are inherent in reality are intrinsic. Human beings perceive it in some form. Therefore, some phenomena arise from the fact that they perceive it in a certain form. Now, to give a feeling, to give examples of this, I simply rely upon physical theory. But that in itself is not a part of philosophy. Now, just to show you that it has no philosophic significance and doesn't make any difference, imagine the following. Imagine that none of the qualities that we directly perceived were intrinsic at all. Imagine the following, because I just want to show you that it doesn't make any difference. Imagine that reality was comprised of, I don't know, say puffs of energy. Don't ask me what I mean by that, because I don't know. But just suppose. It was comprised of puffs of energy. And these puffs in some way had no extension at all. They weren't spread out spatially. They had no length, no breadth, no depth, etc. I don't know what they're like. Even if that were the case, and that was the intrinsic phenomenon, nothing whatever about human sense perception would be invalidated. It would still be the case that those puffs, in certain combinations, acting upon our sensory apparatus, were perceived in the form of a three-dimensional material world with the various characteristics that we observe. And it would only be because we observe reality in this form that we are able, by a process of reasoning and scientific knowledge, to reach the knowledge one day that intrinsically there are just the puffs. The fact that we perceive them in a certain form would not be a block to our grasping the nature of reality. It would be our means of perceiving reality and of getting to know what was actually out there. Now, I have no reason to believe there are these puffs, but I make that up just to show you that there is no philosophic significance in this question of which is on the side of the intrinsic and which is on the side of the objective. And consequently, if you're interested in that question, you go to a physicist and talk to him about the status of light waves and what is the nature of his theory as to why he believes in light waves and the atomic theory of matter and so on. And you judge the theory of physics on the basis of the evidence that the physicist has. Period. Now let's see if we can take one brief one in the last minute. Can anything be properly labeled subjective? Yes, I think things can properly be labeled subjective. Here you have to make the kind of distinction that I tried to suggest briefly in the lecture. In the strict sense, if subjective means a content of consciousness without any relation at all to reality, now or ever, past, present, or future, then of course in the strict sense there is no such thing as a subjective phenomenon, because consciousness has no content but what it derives from reality. So that even that hallucinatory pink rat, at some point, the consciousness had to be in contact with reality to generate. But in another and very meaningful sense, all sorts of things within consciousness can be subjective. Whenever a consciousness has a content which is not in contact with reality, which represents an aberration, a detachment, a break with reality, in that respect and to that extent, even if the ingredients initially came from reality, that particular combination in that consciousness is in that moment subjective. It's cut off from reality. So, for instance, if you believe you're Napoleon, now, in a sense, you had to get the idea of Napoleon and so on from, ultimately, your contact with reality. But in this moment, if you believe you're Napoleon, you're jolly well right, that's a subjective viewpoint. Meaning, it's a state, it's a thought in your mind that is cut off from any facts of reality. It's a phenomenon of consciousness with no anchor, no foundation, no basis in reality. And in this sense, there surely can be, and unfortunately are, a great many subjective phenomena. Now, our time is up. I will take the rest of these questions and look through them and see if I can get some of them next week. So we'll continue next week. Thank you.
This course continues with Lecture 12.